Hey everyone. I've been meaning to do this for some time now, and finally got around to actually making it. I'm a nursemaid, and I just want to make a newcomer-friendly guide to her, since she is pretty hard. Before I continue, I want to make things clear that Nurse is not an easy killer to learn. She is obviously by far the hardest, and she's very punishing to all your mistakes. So you can't just pick her up and immediately be good with her. She takes a lot of practice. However, once you get your blink range muscle memory kind of down, you will find that everything else after that is much easier and your improvement will be exponential compared to that. The first hurdle of getting the basics of blinking is definitely the hardest part. You will lose many games, which is unfortunate, especially because survivors aren't always very nice about it, but once you understand her, you will be basically an unstoppable force of nature. Nurse's power, Spencer's last breath, is incredibly unique in that she can go through obstacles, like pallets and windows and walls, whatever. To compensate for this incredible ability, she has a base movement speed of 96.25%, which I'll probably just round to 96%, which is 3.85 meters per second, which is slower than a running survivor. A running survivor is the base, and it's at the 100% speed. So running survivor, and it's 4.0 meters per second. So unlike every other killer in this game, you can't just rely on a faster speed. To catch someone, you actually are fully reliant on your power. The nurse has 2 blinks by default, which can be altered with her iridescent add-ons, but that doesn't matter right now. The first blink has a max range of 20 meters, and it takes a full 2 seconds to charge. For the max range, of course. The nurse will clench her fist when it's fully charged. So that's how you know it's fully charged. Your first blink is actually not meant to be overly precise. I find a lot of newer nurses seem to struggle in that regard, and they try and blink right directly on top of the survivor, which isn't actually what you want to do. Your first blink is meant to kind of close the gap and to set up your second blink, which is where you'll be getting the majority of your hits. Occasionally, a survivor will be caught on your first blink, like if they turn back, or sometimes you just get it. Or sometimes they just walk right into you, and you don't even have to blink. But that doesn't happen nearly as often. The second blink, or the chain blink, has a maximum range of 12 meters if you time it absolutely perfectly. The window to chain blink is 1.5 seconds. If you don't blink after those 1.5 seconds, you will fall into fatigue. And fatigue will last anywhere from 2 seconds to 3.5 seconds. If you blink once, you'll have fatigue of 2 seconds. Using both blinks will give you a fatigue of 2.5 seconds. And attacking, whether you whiff or you hit, you will get an extra second of fatigue. So of course your goal is to minimize your time in fatigue, because you're slow, you can't see, and generally it's not where you want to be. So one of the biggest things I can say is don't go for hits if you're not 100% sure that you will hit them. I am particularly bad for this. I'm very ambitious with some of my hits. Don't be like me. Her tokens, because she has blink tokens, so that she can't just constantly blink around. It used to be that way, but they actually changed it because it was just incredibly powerful. And at that point, it's just, you didn't really need to manage your blinks, so it wasn't as much skill-based. It was still skill-based, but not quite as much. I think it was rightfully so that they changed it. Each token will have a base recharge rate of 3 seconds, and will begin recharging during your fatigue. Due to blinking being your only kind of viable means of catching survivors and traveling the map, since you're so slow, I recommend that you only use 1 blink for map travel. Unless you're using both recharge add-ons, then at that point, go for it, because your blink will be back by the time fatigue's over. But otherwise, don't do that. Another thing about the nurse is that, just like the Wraith, she is traveling through the spirit world when she blinks. Which means, basically, that she can be light burned. Flashing a flashlight onto a nurse will prevent her from charging up a blink, and flashing it on her while she's already charging a blink will stun her and put her into fatigue. It very rarely happens, and it's even more rare for it to actually prevent you from getting hit, but I've had survivors try it. It usually goes one of 3 ways, which is number 1, they try and light burn me, but I'm close enough to just float over and hit them. Number 2, they try to light burn me, but I already have my blink charged and released, and they're about to get smacked. Because you have to be so close to use a flashlight, like with Wraith and Cloaking, meaning I'm charging for far less than 2 seconds, which is a max range blink. Or number 3, they successfully burn me and stun me into fatigue, which I actually have not had that happen yet, and I have hundreds of hours in this killer. After the stun, I would, in theory, immediately catch up with you and hit you, because that's how it works. You won't make enough distance during, it's a 5-second stun, and like a D-strike, and you would not make enough distance because both of my blinks would be recharged during the stun. So, RIP Survivor. The quote-unquote best light burn I've ever had would be, there was this one on Haddonfield. It was a David in House of Pain on Haddonfield, and the pallet was thrown in the bottom there, as I'm sure you can picture. And so he used his flashlight on me there so that I could not directly blink over the pallet. Unfortunately for him, I just moved out of line of sight and blinked through the wall on an angle. So it didn't quite work out. For beginners, I would recommend that you definitely make use of the plaid flannel add-on. I've heard quite a few people argue that you should learn to blink without it because you'll rely on it, but that I promise you that is stupid and you will not become reliant on it. When I learned, I used the plaid flannel, and I did it in sort of a 3-step kind of process to measure progress. And so step 1 would be using the plaid flannel to know where you're going. Step 2 would be visualizing the plaid flannel just in your head, but not using it. And then number 3, which is where you want to be, and where all the good nurses are, is the pure muscle memory. So you don't need to think about where you're landing kind of at all, you just kind of know. Another add-on that's great for both beginners and, anyone who's playing nurse is the wooden horse. This completely gets rid of the extra fatigue from attacking. The description is minorly misleading because it says that it moderately decreases it, but it actually just completely negates all attacking fatigue, which is an extra second of fatigue. It's good for if you don't know your attack distance as well, if you're like me and over-ambitious, or to help bait out dead hards if you have some really high-level survivors that are last-second dead harding, then it's actually very useful, and it's just a brown add-on, so you should have plenty. Nurses do not use a lot of the perks that most killers make good use of because of her unique mechanics. There's no need for Enduring or Spirit Fury or Bamboozle when you can just, go through it. Any perk that would be considered a chase perk, such as Play with Your Food, or something that relates to pallets and windows, such as, of course, Brutal Strength or any of the above I just mentioned, are not the most useful on her because she doesn't need them. She has extremely, extremely strong chase mechanics, obviously, because, again, the only things that survivors have to break chase, she just ignores. Stealth perks also tend to not be the most effective on her, because if you haven't noticed yet, she screeches like a goddamn banshee every single time she blinks. Another perk that is not useful on Nurse would be Save the Best for Last, because every time you hit someone after a blink, you go into fatigue, which means any time that you save with Save the Best for Last doesn't matter because you're in fatigue anyway. The build I currently use, and that you'll probably see in most of my clips, is Ruin, Discordance, Barbecue and Chili, and of course Shadowborn. I would not recommend this build for beginners because the only game slowdown I have is Ruin, which can be and often is cleansed very, very, very early into the match. A few good builds that you could use for beginners, depending on what perks you have, would be Corrupt Intervention, Pop Goes the Weasel, Barbecue and Chili, Nurse's Calling, Sloppy Butcher, No-Ed if you really struggle and want No-Ed, Bitter Murmur, Thanatophobia is good. It's also one for Teachables, so is Nurse's Calling. And if you know how to use it, then I very much recommend Whispers. You can look up guide videos on how to use it if you're not sure, but it's probably the best tracking perk, and it does not require any Teachables. It's just something that will appear. It's good. Discordance is another good one that I use personally. You can use Discordance. Surveillance is good. Tinker can be good too. I do recommend Sloppy Butcher and Pop in particular for new people because it only gives you slowdown for actually working for it. So if you don't hit a survivor, Sloppy's not going to go off, and if you don't hook survivors, you're not going to get slowdown from Pop. So you actually have to do well to do better, in a sense. So it rewards good play rather than just doing ruin stuff. A pretty hot topic, if you will, amongst nurse mains is whether to Shadowborn or not to Shadowborn. Personally, I absolutely love it. Like, I love it. I love the perk. I don't really require it, but I prefer it and use it because I just love that extra 15 degrees of being able to see. It makes seeing in fatigue and keeping track of survivors in fatigue and not in fatigue even much, much easier. In my clips also, you'll notice that my nurse looks faster when she's just walking than someone who's not using Shadowborn, and that just happens with the extra FOV. Anyone who uses Shadowborn on any killer, you'll notice they go faster, or they look like they're going faster. It's really just a preference thing. You don't have to use it if you'd rather have 4 perks that don't include, just an increased field of view, then, you don't have to use it, but I recommend it and I really like it, so it's definitely something I would recommend. So let's talk about Shack at first. It's, pretty iconic and it can be pretty annoying to deal with as a nurse. I'm not a huge fan of it myself, but I can usually get a hit off it because, if you know how to deal with it, you know how to deal with it and you can get a hit because, you're the nurse. But I don't particularly enjoy it. The best way to deal with this is honestly to go to the inside of Shack. So survivors will be staying on the outside for that because, they want to stay away from you typically. And then you can watch where the survivor is going through the small cracks and holes in the walls of Shack, in most of the Shacks. I'm not sure if all of them still have it, but... And watch through the window to determine their location. If you really, really don't like Shack and have a really hard time with it, you honestly can just not loop there, just like any killer. If you don't want to loop somewhere, just don't do it. But, you should definitely learn, obviously, at some point, because people like to run the Shack. Despite it being pretty well known that pallets aren't very useful against a nurse, you will find that survivors still try and make use of them, and you will still get stunned by them, occasionally. It's often because you're blinking to a pallet, whether to get to an area with line of sight, or because the survivor's camping the pallet. So on the rare occasion, you will get stunned by a pallet, and it sucks even more because you get stunned by the pallet, you get the stun, and then you get put into fatigue. It's unfortunate, but it happens. It's a little embarrassing, but it definitely happens. The most common juke you will see survivors try is that they will run back towards you while you're blinking to force you to blink through them. Mind you that if they do this, they will continue to do this, and it becomes very predictable, very readable. You can undershoot your blinks purposefully so that you will hit them when you come into your blink, because they are running back into you. High-skilled survivors often will keep their movements very varied and unpredictable, but in the end, if you are a good nurse, then you will come out on top, no matter the skill level of survivors, because the nurse ignores a lot of pretty much everything that the survivors have to keep the killer at bay. There are often sometimes also survivors who will camp pre-thrown pallets. You can blink to one side and then the other because, you have 2 blinks, and then quickly turn and hit them if they vault. Or you can begin to charge a blink and act like you're going to blink to the other side, but instead you release your blink down at the floor so that you just blink up and stay on the one side, and they will probably vault into you. It's pretty funny, and then you get your hit. That's all I have for right now. I will discuss her add-ons later in more detail, but I will keep that for a separate time right now. I will end with this weird, cool blink bug I did by accident by timing my blink right as the endgame menu loaded in. It's kind of cool. Take a look.